And we're back on the Capital City Recap, and is frequently the case, pardon my stumbles here today, ladies and gentlemen, I run into folks while I'm on my tours of duty at the state capitol, and the other day I ran into a gentleman, had a brief conversation with him. I saw his lapel pin or something, said, hey, there's a guy I need to talk to, and that is Scott Tillman. He is the National Field Director for U.S. Term Limits. It is a national-based organization, and they are focused on creating a term limits situation for Washington, D.C. Of course, we're very familiar with term limits here in the state of Michigan. We've had them for over 2 decades. And this effort is similar. And so when I saw Scott, I thought, hey, you know what? I really have been paying attention to a national term limits movement for Washington, D.C. But as popular as Congress is or is not, maybe it's time to talk. So, Scott, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
All right. So why don't you just give us kind of the basics on who your organization is, where you're based, and then we'll start talking about your particular strategy. Again, I hadn't really been focused on the idea that there was a national level campaign. I know it's kind of been a state level thing. So let's kind of walk through it all.
Going back to the late 80s, early 90s, many states got together and, the Citizens and States with Citizens Initiative, like Michigan, ran initiatives to term limit their own state legislature, as well as a lot of states term limited their congressional delegation. And people thought that was kind of counterintuitive. Why would you term limit your own guys? But people love term limits that much and support them that much that they saw that as a practical way to do it. They figured when we got to a certain number of legislators being term limited, they'd probably just go ahead and term limit everyone. Then in 1995, so about, I want to say it was 26 states had gone through that process and put term limits on their own delegations. And then there was a U.S. Supreme Court decision that said states couldn't term limit their own delegations. Anything had to come through a constitutional amendment. So obviously states were still able to term limit their own state legislatures, just they couldn't term limit their congressional delegations. So for a few years, we were working just on state and local term limits and whatnot. And then we most currently, just a few years ago, we started to push for resolutions, because there's 2 ways in Article 5 of the Constitution to amend the Constitution. One is through Congress, which we've seen lots of times. The other one is through state legislatures. So we've started this new push for that method. But we have an office in Florida and an office in D.C., and we have a presence all over the country.
All right, and as you were mentioning to me, you're the National Field Director, but you do have personnel across the country, and you're doing the state by state. Let's again, just to remind listeners, a little civics lesson, as I have taught high school students civics over several years. The 2 mains for amending the United States Constitution would be either a proposal from Congress itself, adopted by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then sent out to the states. That is how the 27 amendments we have to the Constitution today were adopted. Or, as your strategy is to have 2/3 of the states, is it 2/3 of the states request pass a resolution calling for a convention to consider amendments to the Constitution, and so it would be a convention to adopt a term limits amendment?
Yeah, for an amendment convention, it would require 2/3 of the states, and then for anything to be approved, the Constitution has very specific guidelines that anything to be approved is 3/4 of the states. So it's a little bit lower bar to just have the amendments discussion, and then for the amendment to be approved, it would take 3/4.
Okay. Well, now, I've heard repeatedly, and this is a question that I know I'm sure you hear all the time, is there is the claim that if the states call for a convention to consider amendments to the Constitution, that there is no capacity to restrict it, that a constitutional convention, once called, can run the gamut and could rewrite the whole Constitution if it wanted to. And there has never been successfully a call for a constitutional convention through this mechanism. Where do you come down, and how do you guys explain that or address that issue, saying we only going to call a convention to discuss the amendments that would allow for term limits?
Well, in Article 5 of the Constitution, it specifically says that, an amendment can be called to discuss amendments. Since we're acting within a constitutional allowance, this is written into Article 5. This is one of the 2 ways. It can't go off the rails. The Supreme Court operates underneath guidelines of the Constitution and would say that anything that was operating outside of what the delegates were sent to do would not be allowed. So the process states would get together, the states' legislatures issue these resolutions, and then the resolutions, of course, have to be on the same topic, because there's been actually several hundred different resolutions on a myriad of different topics over the years. And what the courts have said, because some people have been out there and challenged and said, we've had so many of these resolutions that we think there should be a general convention. And the courts have, declined to hear that, because they say they need to be on, what Congress has done is said they need to be on one subject. And unless they're on one subject, we're not going to allow this thing to take place. So the courts and Congress have indicated that, anything that does happen will have to be on one specific subject. And to expect that the courts would allow that to go off the rails and do something different is a big leap, especially since anyone in the United States would be able to, bring a case and say this is, not what is authorized by the Constitution. And then, of course, there's always the ultimate. If somebody did propose something that wasn't, and somehow the convention went along with it, which, states can actually recall the people they send to the convention if they're afraid of that. There's a lot of different checks in the system, but it only takes 13 states to shut it down. Anything that 13 states don't like has no chance at all. So there's a lot of ways to stop it, and a very, very narrow path to achieving a convention to discuss specific amendments.
All right, again, we are talking with Scott Tillman, the National Field Director for U.S. Term Limits here on 1320 WILS. So, Scott, if you're taking the state-by-state approach until you get to the two-thirds of the states, how many states do you have that have passed some sort of a resolution? And you say they have to be on the same subject. Do they literally have to be the same proposal? Because I looked on your website before we came on the air here and saw that you're proposing 3 two-year terms for the U.S. House and 2 6-year terms for the U.S. Senate. Do all the states have to pass that framework, or would it be possible that you could say, okay, the term limits amendments could be discussed, but maybe we would lengthen it to 4 or 5 House terms and 3 Senate terms? So how uniform do these resolutions have to be, and how many have you gotten accomplished?
So we're operating under the assumption, which everybody else who's trying to achieve some specific amendment operates under, and that is that they have to match up exactly. Now, the 3 House and 2 Senate terms that you saw on our website, U.S. Term Limits has 2 programs that we're working on. One is our resolutions to go through the states, and for those we have 2 currently. We're early in the process, just a couple of years in. We have Florida and Alabama. We're expecting good things out of Missouri and Arizona yet this year. And we passed a number of different single camerals in different states. So the House in one state, the Senate in another, and another half dozen states. But we'll have to be coming back to those states next session. The 3-2, so the resolution that we're proposing does not specify the number of terms. We think that it's important that people from Missouri, California, Michigan that have term limits get together. And at this convention, that there should be a discussion. We don't think that it's something that should be dictated and that it says this is what you're going to do, this is the amendment you're going to propose. No, we think that it's important to have a national discussion. This would be, frontline news, front page news every day of the week, and we think that that's an important discussion to have. Now, U.S. Term Limits also pursues a pledge program. So the resolution program, of course, goes to your state legislators, Michigan House, Michigan Senate, Indiana House, Indiana Senate, Ohio House, Ohio Senate, Florida House, Florida Senate. But our pledge program, we go to congressional candidates, people who are actually running for Congress, because there's 2 ways, of course, to amend the Constitution. One way is the resolution way, which we're talking about, that takes 2/3. The other way is for Congress to send out an amendment. For Congress to send out an amendment, we're very specific, because back in 1994, so we asked congressional candidates to sign a pledge, and that's the pledge where the 3-2 number comes in. Back in 1994, with the Contract with America, for those of us who remember, when Newt Gingrich and the Republicans put that up and were going to hold votes and all those things, one of the platforms, or one of the planks in that platform, was term limits on Congress. And what happened was, everybody went in and supported some term limit, but so some supported 6, some supported 8, some supported 10. They supported I want to say there's 3 different bills and different numbers. And they were all able to go home to their constituents knowing full well that there wouldn't be a vote, or that none of the votes would have enough, but that they could go home and claim that they had supported term limits. So voters felt, like a fast one had been pulled on them. And since then, we are very specific with what we ask congressional candidates to sign, because we want voters to know that if U.S. Term Limits is telling them this candidate is serious about term limits, then what is this candidate serious about? So we're very serious about 3 House terms and 2 Senate terms for the congressional pledge. That's different from the resolutions. Of course, if the resolutions aggregate and we get to the convention, there will be a discussion, and we don't expect that to be 3-2. But what we are expecting from Congress is that they go the way the voters want them to. And from polling, going back to the early 90s, we know that, aside from 1 term in office and 1 term in prison, the second most favorite term limits people support is 3 in the House and 2 in the Senate. And that's why we picked that number.
Okay, Scott, let me very, very quickly, because we're really coming close out of time here. Where's Michigan at? Do you expect that there is enough momentum that our legislature might take this up? And how long is your time frame before you think you could get to the required number of states? And these are quick, short answers.
So 7 years is where we're at in our, 5 to 7 years on a rosy timeline. And Michigan we introduced it last session in the House and got some mileage. We weren't able to get it out and get it into the Senate, but next session, I'm hopeful that we can get it into the Senate and in the House and do something here in the next 2 years.
All right, fantastic. Well, we appreciate the time with, again, Scott Tillman, National Field Director for U.S. Term Limits. Appreciate your being with us.
Thank you, Ed.